16th century picture of what was happening on Halloween night in the North Berwick Kirk. So you've got this huge meeting of people coming in all different ways. There are people being magically transported through the air by the devil.
This is very clearly demonic witchcraft.
They're in the graveyard. Doors fly open. Blows again, suddenly, boom, candles. And there is the devil.
So the devil climbs into the pulpit in the fashion of a Christian minister.
And then the horror. The devil points out graves. They go, they open the graves, they get the corpses, they get out their knives, and they start cutting off all the fingers, and all the toes, and the noses for the corpses, and the devil says, grind them into a powder, and you're going to go and do bad magic with it. Because this is what I command you as the devil, to go and do all the evil you can. And that is a 16th century picture of what's going on at a witches' meeting in North Berwick Kirk.
In a matter of months, these suspected witches will have to fight for their lives in Scotland's first ever mass witch trial, presided over by the king himself.
The story first begins when we get a servant called Giles Duncan. Giles is questioned by her master, a man called David Seaton.
David Seaton is a baillie of the borough of Tranent, so this means he's sort of a Scottish local government official, but he also runs the court. So he's an important guy, he's part of the legal machinery of this little patch of Scotland.
He became suspicious of his servant Giles because she had a tendency to sneak out at night.
So he grabs poor Gilly and he tortures her. He sort of practically strangles her with a rope. He keeps her awake. So he thinks, I bet she is going to witches' meetings. And he thinks she's maybe been trying out some of that magical healing.
Women like Giles would potentially provide healing services to their community, often using herbs, perhaps with some kind of incantation spoken at the time of application.
Healers don't really have any training. There are a few herbs that they use that are recognised as having medicinal powers today, such as foxglove. Most of even the herbs are probably what we would call placebos.
Imagine she's getting threatened and terrorised, and so Julie Duncan starts saying whatever she thinks will make David Seaton leave her alone.
What we see in so many witch trials is that she starts to name names. One of the names that then comes up is the name of Agnes Sampson. Agnes Sampson seems to have been an older woman than Giles, probably fairly established in her community, had seemingly worked for some time as a healer.
Now, Agnes is versatile. Agnes heals animals as well as people.
Something you see with a lot of these healers is that they would recite charms that were often a strange mixture of different influences. A bit of Latin, a bit of familiar prayers that they had probably heard at church.
Agnes is your sort of all-round spiritual, magical healing consultant. She's got a big reputation. Mostly what she's healing through are these sort of Latin, Catholic, Christian charms.
The church doesn't like that Elements of Catholicism often get brought into the healing practices. It's 30 years on from Scotland's Reformation, which takes place in 1560. In theory, the country is supposed to have converted into this beacon of Protestantism, this glowing godly society. In practice, of course, so many old traditions and old practices do remain that women like Agnes or Gillis would employ without necessarily knowing they were doing anything wrong. But the church is suspicious of what they're doing for that reason, and because they're doing it as women. Women were thought in general to be weaker, perhaps to be more motivated by sex, and therefore to be more susceptible to the temptations of the devil. A woman, compared to a man, had less power to make her own living. They weren't actually even allowed to give evidence in court. They're not trusted to speak for themselves or to have a clear enough mind, clear enough judgment to be able to give you an accurate version of events. Prejudices like this can lead people then to think that women are much more susceptible to the devil and his charms. People accused of witchcraft were often said to have cursed others.
You fear a man's physical violence. That's how people think about this in early modern Europe. But if you know that a woman is angry with you, are you going to fear that she will come round and beat you up? You fear is women's curses, and you fear women's harmful magic. They do say things like, "You will regret this," or "May the devil drag your soul through hell." If a woman's angry and she says something like that, and then something bad happens, you go, that must be because she was a witch.
When you get a stereotype in your head about people and you then go out and make arrests, well, you're much more likely to question the people who fit your stereotype. For witchcraft, the stereotype in Scotland is it's much more likely to be a woman.
There's an idea that women should be sticking in their own lane. They shouldn't be meddling with healing practices that are best reserved for men who have actually been through university. Agnes is not necessarily thinking she's doing anything wrong, certainly not anything evil, but in the eyes of the ministers, she's doing something that at best is ineffective, at worst is actually offering herself to the devil through illicit practice.
Now, at this point, Agnes Sampson has been imprisoned on the behest of the local church court. And the church has basically put out a call saying, do you know anything bad Agnes has done? Have you seen Agnes practicing magic? Have you heard of Agnes practicing magic? And David Satan goes, I've been torturing my servant girl, and yeah, she says Agnes was hired to get at me. And of course, the church are very interested in that. And then Agnes gets interrogated.
So Scotland has had sporadic witch trials before the 1590s, but it's at this point that something new happens.
Gillis and Agnes are subjected to brutal torture for days on end, pressured to answer leading questions. Eventually, to stop the agony, they confess to attending the witches' Sabbath at the North Berwick Kirk. But the interrogators also extract a new treasonous confession. Both women are forced to admit they used diabolical magic to harm the King of Scotland, James VI.
So Julie and Agnes end up imprisoned in Edinburgh. That's a terrifying thing if you're just an ordinary person. And suddenly you're on trial for your life, and the king himself is questioning you.
Why is the King of Scotland, James VI, so fixated on two common faith healers, when he should be focused on a much greater prize, the throne of England?
We've got Queen Elizabeth I on the throne of England. She has no children, and everybody in Europe is looking to see who will be the next ruler of England.
James is one candidate. He and Elizabeth are related. He's also a Protestant. So James is very concerned with this question of the English succession and are trying to put himself in the best possible position to accede to the throne after Elizabeth's death.
James VI was Mary, Queen of Scots' only child. For him to accede to the English throne, it is vital he finds a wife and an heir to continue his royal line.
James and his courtiers start looking around for a suitable wife for him. They fix on one of the daughters of Frederick II of Denmark. This is Anna of Denmark. Anna's 14. And they do then get betrothed. James starts to make plans to bring her over to Scotland. In September 1589, Anna sets off from Denmark, but the voyage is beset by problems.
Suddenly, this huge storm blows up.
The ship starts to leak. They have to pull over in Norway.
When you send a princess, you don't just send one ship. You know, there were a whole fleet of ships. Keeping a fleet together is particularly difficult. 16th century sailing ships, they don't have any brakes, they're a bit hard to steer. As soon as trouble breaks, you can maybe keep one ship going, but you cannot keep a whole fleet. And so the admiral basically had to abort the voyage.
They get the ship fixed up, set off again, but there is continual bad weather. The waves beat them back. And they end up going back to Norway again.
Anna's fleet makes 6 attempts to sail to Scotland. Each time, they are forced to turn back.
They then write to the court in Scotland, and Anna explains that the plan now is to remain in Norway for the winter and come to Scotland in the spring. This is difficult for James to hear, and it occurs to him to do something decisive.
James says, right, that's it, I'm going for it. I'm fitting out a ship and I am going to fetch her. And I'm going to leave basically a committee behind to govern Scotland while I go and I get Anna.
James also encounters bad weather along the way. It's still stormy, it's still rough. There are still seemingly all kinds of perils associated with the journey. There's a sense for James and those around him that this whole project has been beset by all kinds of difficulties in a way that is uncomfortable, perhaps even suspicious.
James makes it safely to Norway, where he and Anna are married. They travel on to Anna's homeland, Denmark, where they spend the bitter winter, waiting for the dangerous storms to subside.
James spends 6 months or so in Denmark. He meets this important Danish theologian. They may well have discussed witchcraft.
In Trier in Germany, we've already had significant outbreaks of witch hunting, and stories about this would have made their way to the Danish court. These accounts of what witches might get up to were already in circulation. There are theories that he went and filled his head with all of this sort of stuff and then brought it back to Scotland direct from Denmark. So James and Anna set off on the 26th of April, and they manage the voyage this time, arrive back in Scotland on the 1st of May. questions start getting asked in Denmark about what happened to this voyage and how it all went so wrong. And you can imagine that for the people who are in charge of proceedings, this is all a bit uncomfortable. The Danish admiral blames the governor of Copenhagen. They talk to the governor of Copenhagen, who then says, I think you ought to be looking a bit further down the social scale here. There might have been these witches interfering with the ships, making all of these things go wrong. So there's a process of passing the buck until we get down to the people who are least able to defend themselves.
Then you get news coming from Denmark that there are witches who've been convicted, who've confessed to trying to sink James and Anna and trying to stop the marriage.
And you can imagine this is actually what James wants to hear. James is a very devout and godly man. He would have believed that everything that happens is ordained by God, and it all fits James's desire to see himself as pretty important. If he can believe that Satan is out to attack him specifically, it puts him in this really significant position.
King James is convinced more dark forces are conspiring against him. His trusted allies, the Setons, reveal they have uncovered witches working their evil magic close to the king's own home in Edinburgh.
The Setons are the people James stayed with when he was waiting for Anna to come across. And they will have chatted about Anna and about when is the ship coming and have there been storms. So it's really, a very short halt to the king is now involved.
The Setons share the chilling confessions extracted from Gelis during cruel and unrelenting torture.
James then decides it's time for him to figure out for himself what's going on. It's a sign of just how important it was to him that he determines to interrogate the suspects at his own home, at Hollywood House.
Not all kings would have done that.
These are often poor, uneducated women who are getting dragged into a place they must never have imagined they'd set foot, surrounded by all of these very educated men, the kinds of social superiors whom they are very much not accustomed to defying. It puts a new kind of pressure on the accused women.
People accused of witchcraft like Agnes undoubtedly understand that they're on trial for their lives.
Agnes Sampson is kept in the Tolbooth from November of 1590 until January of 1591.
The Tolbooth is a large administrative building. It's next to the church. It's the usual place where the Privy Council meets. It's a prison, it's a courthouse, it's where actual trials take place. As far as we can tell, many of the interrogations also take place in that building.
When it comes to questioning, several men would come and interrogate the suspect. Usually this involved asking quite a lot of leading questions. Typically your interrogators will be there asking things like, did you make a pact with the devil? Did you have sex with him? Did you meet other witches at a nighttime gathering? And pressure would be applied.
Throughout history, countless horrifying methods have been used to elicit confessions of witchcraft. The trials in Scotland are no different.
The major way this is done is by torturing them through sleep deprivation.
Sleep deprivation over a very short period of time, within 48 hours, has the intended effects. People can start to hallucinate. You become extremely disorientated. You can't think, you can't focus, you can't concentrate, you can't process. Things may be said to you that you start to just repeat. So you start to even maybe believe what you're actually saying. So this is where questions can be leading, but also plant in information. It creates the perfect conditions for people to say what the torturers want them to say.
There's also physical violence that goes on as well.
Agnes has this rope drawn around her head and tightened.
They seem to have used thumb screws, things that they tighten on the fingers or the thumb.
We have at least 2 people who commit suicide in custody over the course of the North Berwick hunt. We have someone else who dies of being tortured.
And I'm sorry to say that, most of the authorities who are carrying out what I would call torture today, the way they do it is by calling it something else. Just don't call it torture, you can get away with whatever you like. I can see that they are putting considerable pressure on these people to confess.
So your interrogators are hoping to extract a confession, but they're also hoping to find visible evidence of somebody's pact with the devil. The way this could be done was by locating a witch's mark.
One type of mark, and this is the one that seems to be particularly important in North Berwick, is the type of mark that you detect with a pin.
This is a very traumatic thing because it involves being stripped naked. And this is usually done in public with people standing round. And what they do is they take a long pin, not like a little dressmaker's pin, more like a big hat pin, and they shove it into you all over. They're looking for a place where they can put the pin in and you won't feel it.
So in the case of Agnes, supposedly they eventually find a mark on her genitals.
A coercive and humiliating procedure. Particularly if you're then told, and we found the mark. Right, so we know you're guilty. Are you going to confess now? This seems to be the point at which several people break down and decide that they will confess it. It is generally easier to cooperate with the interrogators. The interrogators tell you what they want. If you just give them it, you get an easier time than if you argue or refuse. This, unfortunately, is why we get false confessions.
For Agnes, once they had what they needed from her in the way of a confession, that's when things get moved on to Holyrood House, when there's actually something to put before the king. So Agnes has been primed by the interrogation process to tell particular stories. And when she gets brought out in front of James, she plays her part. She gives this account of how at Halloween she went to this Sabbat.
You get accounts of many witches' meetings where they're hauling up the devil, doing magic with the devil.
Typically, stories about the Sabbat are not so likely to be coming from the lower levels of society, from the accused people themselves. These are ideas that are getting introduced during the interrogation process.
It's the interrogators, they've read all this stuff. They're saying, how are you going to kill the king? Were you going to do it like this? Were you going to do it like that?
They have to tell a story because they're being tortured. They can't remain silent. The interrogators want credible details.
Agnes talks about how she suspended a toad upside down and collected the venom that fell out of it. And she used this to make a poison that she wanted to use on the king. She asked supposedly a man of his bedchamber to bring her some of his linen that she could then anoint with this poison. So we're getting at this point this conspiracy against James himself. James is initially reluctant to believe these stories these alleged witches are telling. But then Agnes whispers into his ear the words that he said to his new wife in their bedchamber on their wedding night. James is supposedly astounded by this and suddenly realizes that in fact it's all true. Now we have this great satanic conspiracy that James sees as a real and genuine threat to himself and to the whole nation. Agnes is found guilty on the 27th of January 1591, and she's executed the next day.
We imagine history's witches burnt alive at the stake. But this horrifying act was surprisingly rare.
You would strangle people before burning them as a somewhat more humane death sentence. One reason to burn bodies is that it created this impressive public spectacle. It made a real statement about your power as government. Another reason to burn the body of a witch is so that the devil can't use her corpse for any trouble after she's gone. So there was this fear about the corpse that was left behind and how that could continue to inflict misery on communities.
They probably have built the pyre in advance of the trial. They're ready to go if and when the right verdict is handed down. So the pyre will be ready, Agnes will be strangled, and then burnt. Castle Hill, it's on the top of a hill, very visible thing. It will be seen for miles, it lasts for hours. It's a very dramatic spectacle. People will have gathered, in hundreds or even thousands to watch this. Various people are still in prison, and one of them is poor Giles Duncan, with whom it all started. She is in prison for over a year.
Presumably because she was very useful to her interrogators, saying whatever they wanted her to say.
She's going to be worn down. She's going to be tired of the treatment she's undergoing. When these men come to her who are educated, who have this superior social status, and start insisting on what she needs to be telling them, she's probably going to be looking for a way out. She confesses what they want to hear. Gillis is brought before James herself. Again tells this story that she's been fed about her activities. She says she was at this sabbat. She raised these storms. James was said to have been very interested in these proceedings.
Broken from months of brutal torture, Gillis names more witches. She begins to accuse members of Scotland's aristocracy, names fed to her during interrogation.
One of the high-ranking women who got accused was Barbara Napier.
She is a member of the Edinburgh elite. So quite a well-connected person.
Barbara Napier is accused of consulting with witches, but also initially of engaging in witchcraft herself. And initially, the jury acquits her.
They're not convinced. They think she's an honest woman, and the king goes mad about it. He wants them put on trial for it.
An interesting feature of the Scottish legal system in this period is that juries could themselves be prosecuted for returning the wrong verdict. In James's mind, this is what's going on here. The jury has been presented with compelling evidence and they've come out with the wrong answer. He starts putting some pressure on them. Barbara is then convicted.
Luckily, Barbara pleads pregnancy. We know ultimately she survived. She wasn't burned, she got away.
Although the vast majority of the accused witches are women, a small number of men are also convicted.
Another figure who's accused is this Haddington schoolmaster called John Fian. John Fian had supposedly served as the devil's secretary during the Sabbat, presumably as one of the few literate people present. John Fian is subjected to a wide range of pretty gruesome tortures. Eventually, after holding out for a long time, he does confess and he is executed. So another prominent figure who's accused is Euphane MacCallion, a relative of David Seaton, who first questioned Gillis Duncan. She, again, is an example of the higher tiers of Scottish society getting drawn into witch hunting.
And there's real effort put into saving her. But they don't succeed. I mean, you've got the king pushing for conviction. And in the end, Euphemie's executed. She is sentenced to be burned alive.
I think this is possibly the king himself, having been so cross at not getting Barbara Napier executed. You can almost imagine him banging the table. Right, I'm really going to make my point this time.
In total, about 60 or 70 people are drawn into these trials.
For over a year, Gillis Duncan, the key witness, has been trapped in prison as one of the first witches accused. She provided her torturers with a torrent of names and information. But her time is up. She's finally summoned to meet her terrible fate.
The accused would not necessarily have legal representation, typically would not even testify in court. All that would get trotted out would be the confession they had already supplied. So they don't really have much space to stand up for themselves. If they have already confessed under torture, there's relatively little opportunity to then change their mind.
She was taken to Edinburgh's Castle Hill on a December afternoon to be strangled and burned.
Gillis does try to backtrack.
At the stake, she recanted everything she said. She said it was all lies. She admits that she has lied because of torture about all the other women, but she doesn't want to go to her death with that on her conscience.
But it's too late at that point. A sentence has already been passed in the mind of James, in the mind of the people hearing her case. So Gillis is finally executed on the 4th of December, 1591.
Just what goes through these people's minds when they're tied to the stake? It's hard to imagine.
For James, however, it's still unfinished business.
King James is not satisfied that the likes of Agnes and Gillis, mere common folk, were behind the plot to kill him. He feels he is worthy of a more significant foe. He hears rumor that someone much closer to home could be behind the plot to kill him. One of the very people he put in charge while he was collecting his bride. his own cousin, Francis Stuart, the Earl of Bothwell.
Francis Stuart, Earl of Bothwell, he is James's cousin. He's sometimes described as a loose cannon. I think that's a great way to describe him. He has a lot of run-ins with James VI. He promises he's going to be a good guy and he's going to reform his ways while James is in Denmark. When James comes back, well, James is not really sure that Bothwell's been reformed. James comes to believe, because somebody is getting the accused witches to say it, that Bothwell is the mastermind behind this alleged conspiracy. The version that the witches have been tortured into telling James is that the Earl of Bothwell decided he was scared of James, he thought James might execute him, and therefore he decided to get his revenge in first and to murder James.
It's discovered the rumors incriminating Bothwell come from one man, a renowned magical healer, Richie Graham.
Now, Richie Graham was what we might call a service magician, someone who travelled around offering his magical talents.
He'd been hanging about with people in very high places.
As a provider of magical services to Scotland's gentry, including Bothwell, Richie Graham is the perfect suspect. He is summoned for questioning.
Graham, in an attempt to save his own skin, then implicates Bothwell for witchcraft.
And then he becomes really important as the person who said, yeah, Bothwell wanted to kill the king. Bothwell roped in me to do it, and I said, oh no, you'll need Agnes Sampson and you'll need all these other women to do it. So he's the person who's stitching all the conspiracy together in a way that satisfies his interrogators and makes them think, well, we've had this really serious, well thought out plot against the king, and the chief villain was the Earl of Bothwell, and here's Richie Graham, the right-hand man, who set it all up.
In April 1591, Bothwell is charged with witchcraft. He is then held in Edinburgh Castle.
It's really astonishing that this goes as high as the Earl of Bothwell being accused of witchcraft. This has started with serving girls being interrogated, and now we have a Earl being imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle. Bothwell knows this isn't a great position to be in, so he very quickly escapes.
Just climbs out of a window and makes a rope out of knotted sheets. And he stays on the run for most of the next 2 years.
Bothwell's finally tried, and he's acquitted. His fellow nobles just do not want to find him guilty, but James is still furious. James doesn't trust him. Bothwell eventually gets exiled. He ends up dying in poverty in Naples.
Interest in witchcraft persists. There are more trials over the course of the 1590s. James is certainly not done inquiring into the subject. And in 1597, he publishes a book entitled Demonology. This was James's attempt to thoroughly survey the topic of how the devil worked, how he might interfere with proper Christians, and to set out some general principles around good Protestant behaviour and keeping clear of the devil. James actually resurrects certain ideas that had mostly fallen by the wayside, like the idea of a trial by water for witches.
One interesting point about the book Demonology is the title. So demonology, knowledge of demons. James seems to have invented that word. The title of James's book seems to be the first time when we find the word demonology in English. The publication of that book gives witchcraft additional credibility.
In 1603, Elizabeth I dies without heirs. James's dreams come true. He succeeds to the throne of England.
Almost immediately, James makes updates to the English Witchcraft Act.
The Witchcraft Act is the act under which witches were prosecuted. By the previous version, witchcraft in England was a capital crime only if the alleged witch had actually murdered somebody. Under the new Witchcraft Act of 1604, basically any witchcraft can be punished by death. England typically hadn't been as severe as Scotland when it came to the pursuit of witches. The Act of 1604 casts a long shadow.
Another thing happens in 1605, 2 years after he's got the English throne. A group of radical subversive Catholics try to blow him up and blow up the entire Houses of Parliament. This is the Gunpowder Plot, the 5th of November 1605. And it really was quite a shocking thing. James persuaded himself that he personally had played a role in uncovering the Gunpowder Plot. And it's not just that he was clever, it's that he's protected by God. And so God would not allow such a wicked deed. That gives the king a huge amount of divine legitimation. I know, let's have a celebration every year, every 5th of November. We will remind ourselves just how wicked that plot was and just how godly the king was.
The North Berwick trials are over, but they have set this dangerous precedent. There is now this established idea that it's possible for people to band together in groups and launch wild demonic conspiracies, attack their communities. And these ideas feed through into other witch trials in the next century.
Scotland's first mass witch trials saw at least 40 people accused, the vast majority women. Through horrific torture and forced confession, some of it overseen by the king himself, over half of the accused were found guilty and put to death for the impossible crime of witchcraft.
It takes a while for witch hunting to die down. A lot of that is a legacy of what happened in the early 1590s. And the stamp of approval that the king put on it all.
It would be another century until the end of witch hunts, trials, and executions in Scotland. Until then, they will spread like wildfire across Europe and to the Americas.
July 1645, it's a hot summer's day, middle of a market town of Chelmsford in Essex. There's always a kind of carnivalesque atmosphere. So there are people selling souvenirs and food and drink. And this is the day of the assizes, so this is where the judges arrive from London. There are 50 counts of witchcraft which are going to be heard. This is going to be England's largest ever witch trial up to this date. The witches have actually been brought there in shackles through the jeering crowd. These are women who are going to be dirty and ragged and terrified. They will resemble the crowd's expectations of what a witch might look like.
And the courtroom is an open space. It's full of spectators, it's full of people who might be shouting things. It will be noisy, it will be hot, it will be smelly, it will be a vile place to be. And at the centre of this terrible maelstrom of accusation and cruelty is Bess Clark on trial for her life.
She's a middle-aged woman, a single mother, a woman who is disabled. It's said she only has one leg, so she'd be leaning on a crutch.
Elizabeth Clark, a pitiful figure, watching her are Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, self-made witch finders, the men who brought her there.
The interrogation of a woman called Elizabeth Clark really kickstarts the investigation of witchcraft that Matthew Hopkins is associated with.
March 1645. Rumors spread through the town of Manningtree that a disabled woman, Elizabeth Clark, has used witchcraft to harm the wife of a local tailor. Magistrates decide to investigate and send interrogators to her home. They search Elizabeth's body for strange and unnatural marks.
The idea of searching women's bodies was the idea of searching them for a witch mark. What they were looking for was a mark on the body of the woman which indicated the point at which the woman's familiar demon had suckled her blood like a breastfeeding baby, but blood, not milk.
So they search Elizabeth Clark's body and they find 3 teats which they consider to be unnatural. So Elizabeth Clark is held under house arrest. There are watchers, local people who are appointed, who will just sit and stare at her as she sits there on her chair. And what they're really waiting for is for her imps to come and visit her.
Ordinary people associated bad magic with the activities of nasty spirits that were variously described as puckles or imps or sprites, and in the biblical language of English Protestants became known as familiar spirits.
The watchers will take Elizabeth Clark and walk her up and down until she's exhausted. Of course, it was an exceptionally cruel and unpleasant thing to do to somebody who was disabled.
So I think with these whole combinations of methods, clearly intended to break her, and by that I mean for her to lose any sense of control or agency. And I think these methods create extreme emotional stress, physical stress and exhaustion. All of these together have the impact that torture is designed to have, which is to make people say what the torturers need them to say or to confess to things that are not true.
So there's this incredibly dramatic scene taking place in this room with the watchers, Elizabeth Clark, who hasn't really said or done very much. So then on the 4th night, on Tuesday the 24th, Hopkins and Stern arrive and take over this interrogation of Elizabeth Clark. So Hopkins is probably in his early 20s, Stern a little bit older, maybe in his mid-30s. He's got young children. Hopkins is a rather more kind of impetuous young man in a hurry, eager to prove himself, less established in society. They are minor gentlemen that have come from the port of Manningtree, where Elizabeth Clark lives, and they have followed some of the suspicions that have been voiced to them by the townsmen of Manningtree, who then asked them to do something about it. The thing about Hopkins and Stern, they're not professional witch finders. They've only really just started out. But what they profess is that they have experience in witchcraft. They start interrogating her, seems quite unforthcoming, and they're just about to leave. And as they leave, Elizabeth Clark suddenly makes this extremely dramatic announcement, which is, "I will show you my imps, for they be ready to come." That then changes the situation in the room.
If you're there in the dark, alone with a witch, and she says she's going to bring demons into the room, naturally enough, if you were a good Christian in the 17th century, you were scared.
So once Elizabeth Clark says, "I'll show you my children, they be ready to come," there's then this parade of animals enter the room. So first of all, you get Holt, who is a cat, and then you get Jamara, who is a white dog, then Vinegar Tom, who is a strange kind of hybrid between a greyhound and seemingly an ox or a bull, and then various other creatures that then follow on. And this leading up to the rabbit or a toad, which Elizabeth Clark says is going to leap down John Sterne's throat and lay toads in his belly.
We're not really clear what's happening here. Is this Elizabeth describing the familiars that she sees? Did people in the room really see something? If so, what? Did an animal run through the room? Was it shadows? What was it?
So this is a witch who's really kind of warming to her own theme, because now she's presenting this picture of absolute phantasmagorical terror, which is probably more than Hopkins and Sterne want to hear, because they're no longer just the disinterested bystanders. She is actually threatening them directly. So that then Hopkins and Sterne start asking more questions about, is she not afraid of these creatures? And she says, why would I be afraid of them? These are my children. So then, you know, if these are her children, who is the father? Well, of course, the father, she says, is Satan. She says that, you know, he's a fine gentleman, he wears a lace collar, that, you know, their lovemaking takes place regularly and lasts half the night. You know, this sounds like this kind of this sexual fantasy of a lonely woman who doesn't have a husband, doesn't have a lover. And, you know, whether she believes this or not, she's certainly saying the kinds of things that Hopkins wants to hear, because, of course, these are deeply horrific, terrifying things for a woman actually to have had sex with the devil.
Elizabeth says not only that she is a witch, but that some of her neighbours are witches as well. By the time her confessions have finished, and she's subjected to several rounds of questioning, she's known 4 or 5 other people from surrounding villages as witches. It's difficult to say why she accused the people that she did. In some cases, they do already have a bad reputation for witchcraft. I think one of the horrifying things about witch trials is that you feel it could happen to anybody. Some of these people come across as being actually quite pious.
So all these women will soon be interrogated and will start confessing to such crimes as causing harm to livestock, to consorting with familiars, and to taking the devil as a lover. The trial comes round in Chelmsford. It's been 4 months since Hopkins and Sterne first interrogated Elizabeth Clark, and by this time we've got at least 30 women being held in Colchester Castle.
The women are all brought before magistrates. That's the first step in an English witch trial in this period. And then you, and the statement that you have made, whether it's a confession or not, are sent off for trial at a court called the Assizes, which is the court for serious crimes in the period.
In front of the whole gathered court, the jurors, the witnesses, the magistrates, the ministers, everyone present, Elizabeth Clark is found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead.
After Elizabeth and the other women have been sentenced, they're marched through the town of Chelmsford to their death.
14 women are taken up to the gallows, led up to the ladder and choked there before this great, jeering, excited crowd.
Hopkins and Sterne would have been very pleased with this outcome. They'd got a number of people executed as witches.
Hopkins and Sterne, whatever they intended to do, they are now actually a witch-finding duo, and people look to them as professional witch finders. They believe that they're on a mission, and their mission is to root out devilry in the community. So they are zealous, they are also ruthless, because they believe that the stakes are incredibly high. This is the godly future of their community and of the region, of the country, which they believe is at stake.
After their recent success, Hopkins and Stern travel farther into Essex, with plans to hunt the evil witches they believe are terrorizing the country. But travel across England is dangerous. The country is deeply divided as a brutal civil war rages.
What the war does is break down structures of authority. The courts stop working as they normally do. Magistrates and judges can't travel to courts, and therefore it becomes a bit of a free-for-all in English justice.
It became possible for men like John Stern and Matthew Hopkins to some extent take matters into their own hands and to set themselves up as witch finders.
So the English Civil War breaks out in 1642, and this is the battle between Crown and Parliament. So Charles I is the king. He's claimed that he is an absolute monarch. He doesn't need Parliament. Parliament think otherwise. But this is, like all civil wars, turns the country upside down. It is, of course, the most dramatic constitutional crisis.
In that context, there was much talk of the devil, because the devil, for both sides, was the secret instigator of the mischief.
The political tumult of the Civil War made many people think that this was the start of Armageddon, and that in that context of fear, you get all sorts of strange omens and apparitions and miracles and happenings. So the London presses pour out all kinds of pamphlets telling these weird and wonderful stories of things that people have experienced, such as a one-eyed kitten with the hands of a child, which seem like evidence that the world is coming to an end. That's the kind of world in which one would expect witches to appear.
Hopkins and Stern travel further into Essex, brutally extracting confessions from accused witches in welcoming towns.
So we've got to understand exactly what Hopkins and Stern are doing in these communities. They don't convict anybody, they don't execute anybody, they don't even really accuse anybody. What they do is that they are facilitators who listen to the suspicions of local people and then encourage those people to come forward and to tell their stories.
And then what they do is they develop methods for gathering pre-trial evidence, and it's in that capacity that they question suspects and torture suspects.
They are not averse at all to physical violence, particularly to starving people of sleep.
Hopkins and Stern travelled around the country with a team of women employed to search the naked bodies of witchcraft suspects to see if they had demonic marks on them.
They also prick various marks with needles to see if they bleed or to see if they're insensitive to pain.
I think they were obsessed with the idea of women's bodies. I think they were troubled by women's sexuality. The number of times that they find demonic marks in what they call the secret parts of a woman is quite striking.
We're dealing with very, very patriarchal societies, societies which see women as inferior, as more sinful, and also women have less legal power, they have less economic power, and so they are less able to defend themselves if they do get suspected or accused.
I think that kind of dehumanising allows all sorts of public shaming, public blaming. It's easy to demonise women and justify torture.
The Hopkins and Stern are actually very brutal. I think they see themselves like soldiers. And of course there are untold acts of brutality which are being committed in the name of both the side of Parliament and the Crown during the ongoing Civil War. they start using methods which are really illegal. And torture is only used in English law in very exceptional circumstances. They're not permitted to do this. But again, the Hopkins and Stern feel that the ends justify the means. Hopkins and Stern, their fame spreads accordingly, as particularly amongst communities which have been sometimes waiting for a generation in order to have the confidence to get rid of the people in their midst who they sincerely believe to be witches.
July 1645. Hopkins and Stern leave Essex and push north into Suffolk.
People would have received Hopkins and Stern as authoritative figures. So they would have brought letters with them, perhaps from magistrates, perhaps from other people saying that their work was good and that the village or town they come to should help them.
When Hopkins and Stern go into Suffolk, they hear confessions that are similar to those that they've heard in Essex, but if anything, they're even more fantastical. Some of these Suffolk confessions give us a sense that they are part of the fantasy of rather lonely, love-starved women.
Stories like Margaret Wyard's. Margaret lived in Framlingham in Suffolk, and she confessed that many years before she had met the devil in the form of a calf. Surprisingly, the calf could speak, and he asked Margaret to have sex with him.
And there are even more men accused as well. Men tell rather similar stories to women about the way that they met with the devil and that they formed the blood pact with Satan, and then familiars came to them and that they sent the familiars out after their enemies.
Suffolk is a triumph for Hopkins and Stern. Their reputation as formidable witch-finders continues to grow. They separate to cover more ground.
This parting of the ways reflects their different character and their different circumstances. Stern is the slightly older family man. He wants to go back to his young children, whereas Hopkins has this real sense of himself as the witchfinder, this charismatic witchfinder who can ride out, which he does on this great lonely trek, probably around 300 miles, as he goes up into Suffolk, into Norfolk, down the east coast of England, and then back round again in a great circuit. One of the reasons he becomes a witchfinder in 1645, I think, lies in his upbringing in his childhood. So he's born in around about 1620. His father, James Hopkins, is a university-educated minister. And so Hopkins is growing up in this sense of Puritanism and the things that threaten Puritanism.
His father dies in the mid-1630s, and his widowed mother, Marie, moves to Manningtree, and she marries the minister of Mistley and Manningtree.
So I think he would have grown up with a very strong sense that there were things that threatened godliness, and that godliness needed to be protected at all costs, and even if that meant actually a kind of an aggressive counterattack against the things which threatened that sense of purity in English religious life. And witches were certainly a part of that. In fact, witches were really the standout emblem. I think people respect Matthew Hopkins when he arrives in their communities because he has this swagger, he has this charisma. He is able to persuade people that he does have authority, and particularly he has experience, which they don't have. He's quite skilled at psychologically understanding what is in the minds of accusers and possibly what's in the minds of the accused as well.
He must have created a climate of enormous fear in those communities that were waiting for him, having told him to come to their town and search for witches.
The scale of the witch hunt that Hopkins and Stern are fomenting, jails absolutely crammed. We have reports that there are as many as 150 witches are in the jails, and witnesses coming forward, all these bizarre stories. They do cause concern in Parliament that justice is possibly not being done. This isn't scepticism about witchcraft, but it is scepticism about correct legal procedure. And so witch finding does raise some eyebrows. One of the key concerns that's voiced in Parliament at this time is word that an ordained clergyman has been arrested for witchcraft.
It still surprises me that John Lowes, the vicar of Brandeston in Suffolk, becomes a witchcraft suspect. He's a Church of England clergyman. He's not an ex-clergyman. He's not a member of some obscure sect. He's the clergyman who served that community for 50 years, and yet he's still accused of witchcraft.
John Lowes is aged about 80 at this point. He is deeply disliked by some members of his congregation. Some of his parishioners absolutely hate him. They've been in court cases with him. They feel he's a very litigious, a very problematic minister. Some of the parishioners of John Lowes think they've got this opportunity now, because of the witch finding, to finally get rid of this minister who they really don't like at all.
I think Hopkins rather assumes John Lowes' guilt. He certainly sees him as a disreputable person.
And he's subjected to the same cruel methods of interrogation by Matthew Hopkins as any of the other suspects, so his age and his gender and his status don't protect him.
Hopkins and others come to him and question him, and they watch him and they walk him, as they have done with the other suspects, their special method of torture, which they don't consider torture, but which of course is.
And is famously swum in the moat of Framlingham Castle in Suffolk. And this was a method by which alleged witches or suspected witches were put into some body of water to see if they sank or swam. And if they sank, they were innocent, and if they swam, the idea was the water was sort of spitting them out and saying they were guilty.
It was yet another of the random and monumentally silly efforts to provide actual forensic evidence for witchcraft.
People often think there's a kind of catch-22 here that meant that you died either way. We know that people were tied to a rope, so the idea that if you were innocent and you sank, you could be pulled out of the water.
It's a bit like kind of being waterboarded, like literally half drowned in the water and then dragged up again.
And in fact, actually, nobody wanted the witches to drown, because that would have been murder. What they really wanted to do was to have this piece of public theatre where somebody was either, proved to be innocent, or more often that they were shown to be guilty. But again, it becomes part of the theatre of an investigation against a suspect, which will get people behind the accusation, even if that actual test itself is not officially sanctioned. This is really one of the most shocking and brutal interrogations that Hopkins oversees during the campaign. John Lowes floats, and therefore it seems like he's guilty because the element of water is rejecting him. One of the strange things about the swimming of John Lowes is in order to underline his guilt, some other people jump in and show that they actually sink to the bottom. Is a sort of a kind of control experiment, really, to show that actually that it isn't just a case that everybody would float, and this really is a way of underlining John Lowes' guilt.
People are enduring pain that carries on for a long time may say whatever they need to for that to stop.
So he admits he's a witch under this pressure.
He lifts up his tongue and he shows that there is a teat under there. That's what's reported, and that's where he feeds his familiars. And he says he sends his familiars to cause all sorts of havoc and destruction, mayhem. A ship sailing off the coast is sunk and all the sailors on it are drowned. And this, he says, he rejoices in. There will now be a reckoning for him.
After his wild confession, extracted under brutal torture, John Lowes is dragged to a jail filled with others accused of witchcraft. News of the vast numbers awaiting trial reaches Parliament. They intervene, keen to ensure the prosecutions are handled in accordance with English law.
The end of July 1645, and Parliament sends a special commission, a special court of Oyer and Terminer it's called, which will go out to Suffolk to oversee the trials there.
It's a measure that's put in place by Parliament to meet this emergency situation of this unprecedented number of witch suspects, because the courts normally are just not set up to deal with this incredibly high number of accused individuals. Parliament's probably also trying to get control of the situation as well. I think they feel that the witchfinders are perhaps getting a little bit out of hand in their efforts.
Trials are set for August the 26th to deal with the cases, it's said, of as many as 150 witches. And of course, the star witnesses will be Hopkins and Sterne. I think there's always going to be a point at which Hopkins and Sterne's methods are going to hit against what is actually permitted procedure.
The court does try to limit some of their more excessive activities. So, for example, it says you mustn't swim witches any longer.
Confessions mustn't be forced. There mustn't be these superstitious extra-legal methods. And that also the communities that are producing these accusations are going to actually have to cover some of the costs. So this serves as a kind of rebuke against Hopkins and Sterne for everything that they've been doing, and particularly the way in which they've been doing it. Inevitably, they're going to come to the attention of those who don't agree with them, and therefore that they are going to find that there'll be enemies who are throwing rocks in their path.
Despite murmurs of opposition to the witchfinders' methods, John Lowes is still brought to the stand to face trial as a witch.
The thing about the court of Oyer and Terminer is that it's not sceptical of witchcraft, it's only sceptical about certain methods. And of course, there is evidence against John Lowes. Villagers have sort of dirt on John Lowes going back for years. So this does become very convincing to the jury, even if some of the methods are disapproved by the judge. In the end, it's the jury that is going to decide. And the jury decide that the evidence is sufficient to find John Lowes guilty of witchcraft. So I think we can imagine that John Lowes must be in a state of utter exhaustion and despair. The judge passes sentence of death upon him, as of course he has to do. And then August the 27th, John Lowes mounts the ladder up to the gallows. But John Lowes, as a minister, asks that he can conduct his own funeral service. An act of defiance against the witchfinders who had brought him to his death.
I think he was showing that he was still a minister of the cloth, that he wasn't a witch, that he was trying to sort of consign his own soul and the soul of the other people being executed with him. He's not giving in to the court's guilty verdict. He's saying, no, I'm not guilty, I'm not a witch, I'm still a minister of God who can perform this sort of necessary ritual as I am dying.
So there's a tremendous amount of public interest in these witch trials. Some of it is enthusiastic and sportive, some of it's rather sceptical. But a lot of this is passing through the London presses. So there are pamphlets, there are printed ballads, which are songs, in effect, about witches, and there are also what they would have called news sheets. This is spreading the news of the witch hunts.
As his fame increases, Hopkins continues his hunt, stopping in the coastal town of Aldborough before pushing into Norfolk.
All towns in England, including Aldborough, are under very significant economic pressure, particularly because of the war. High taxes have been levied, horses have been requisitioned, all sorts of property has been requisitioned by the parliamentary forces, so that everybody is strapped for cash. This is bubbling under at the time of increasing convictions, increasing witch trials, increasing numbers of witches in the jails. Is this just this sense of, can we afford this? Who should pay for it? And is this money being well spent?
In Aldborough, 7 people are accused of witchcraft. At their trial, 5 months later, all 7 are found guilty. But the executions and Hopkins' fees cost a staggering £40, 1/7 of the town's entire annual budget.
So the evidence we have is that Hopkins stays in local inns, he runs up a tab, not excessively, just really for bed and board, but you know, still costs that someone is going to have to meet, and that will always be the local authority, and the local authority will pass it on to the local people. It becomes an expensive procedure. Just the execution of a witch costs £1, which is a lot of money in those days. These costs do start to build up. I think there's not really actually very much evidence that he was extracting huge amounts of money from local people.
I don't think he's really even doing it for glory. I think he's doing it because he feels it's his religious duty. He was put on this earth to go after witches.
Hopkins, to some extent, is the victim of his own success. The more he does, the more his fame grows, the more work he gets. But this inevitably is going to attract adverse comment about the things that he does. You start to feel that Hopkins is going to run out of time and political support.
As Hopkins and Stern move further away from Essex and Suffolk, people are a bit less keen on their methods, they're a bit less keen on their intervention. So by 1646, their efforts are being met with less enthusiasm, and this is particularly the case with a man called John Gall. He's also a Puritan minister, and basically John Gall is very, very critical of the witch finders. He doesn't want them coming to his parish, he doesn't want them encouraging his parishioners to name witches. He thinks they're uneducated upstarts who have no authority or training to do what they're doing, which is kind of actually true.
By 1646, John Gall is one of many men in England who wants this world turned upside down that England's become during the Civil War to be righted again. So he wants proper procedure, proper social relationships, proper law and order. Witch finding to John Gall represents the worst kind of example of men exploiting the breakdown of law and order for their own ends.
So what John Gall does is he preaches against the witch finders and against witch finding, and then he publishes the sermons that he's preached against the witch finders in a book called Cases of Conscience, and it's really a very impassioned criticism. He never names them as Hopkins and Stern, but of course everybody knew who he was talking about. And he basically says they're whipping up popular fanaticism, they have no real expertise, no warrant for what they're doing, they're acting illegally.
By this point in 1646, there's a lot of adverse opinion which is being spoken of in gossip networks, but some of it is also finding its way to print, not just John Gall, but there are also comments made by others about the fact that witch finding is out of control. So the First Civil War ends in June 1646.
The Civil War ends with a parliamentarian victory, meaning that Parliament has assumed authority in the country and it no longer rests with the king, as it has done in all the previous centuries that people can remember.
Soldiers start returning. The economy's been severely disrupted. There is great poverty and dislocation. There's disease spreading as well. And so England is still in a considerable state.
Things become more dangerous, in a sense, than they were before. Soldiers come home from the front, they find their families have been disrupted, some will find their relatives have been executed. Hopkins and Stern are in a pretty difficult position as the Civil War comes to an end.
So Hopkins is invited into the town of King's Lynn. It seems that he is actually welcomed there like some kind of conquering godly hero and feted in the streets. But there are 8 who were tried and 6 of them acquitted. It's very difficult to know exactly what happened. It may well be that the jury themselves were sceptical, not of witchcraft, but of the methods and the evidence which was used. So this is deeply humiliating for Hopkins.
And then in 1647, some of the magistrates in Norfolk begin to question what Hopkins and Stern are doing as well.
There are even more acquittals. This is a sign that the magic, the glamour that he has in getting convictions seems to be running out.
Things have become very difficult for him indeed. Some local gentlemen, he says, have drawn up a list of questions for him, which they present to him at the assize. So one of the questions, for example, asks if he is a witch himself. It says, well, if you know so much about witches, surely you are a witch too. A lot of the questions he's asked are about his methods. People will say to him, are these people not just confessing because you put words into their mouths? Are they not just confessing because you keep them awake all night? Is this not incredibly cruel? What are you trying to do? And he does find it very hard to answer those questions. He just restates over and over again the thing that he's been saying, presumably for months, which is that these are effective methods. They've been authorised by justices of the peace, by the magistrates. He's asked very specific questions about why there is this particular sexualised obsession, this obsession with motherhood. What is it that Hopkins and Stern are fretting about when they strip women naked and get other women to examine them for demonic marks? That's quite a dangerous thing to be asked in front of a court which is holding a witch trial. What if, heaven forbid, they start walking and watching him?
And this is the beginning of the end for him. Not only are his days as a witch finder coming to an end, but so is his life. By the time that Hopkins writes a self-defensive pamphlet against the charges that have been put to him by the gentleman at Norwich, he's probably dying. Probably from the start of the witch hunt, he's almost certainly been suffering from consumption of the lungs. There's always a possibility that Hopkins already knew that he was dying and that there was an added urgency to his work. He's in kind of legacy mode. He's already realising that his time is up and he needs to actually make this his lasting statement about the sincerity of his motives and what he was trying to achieve.
I think it really got to him, those questions, and he wrote the book as a response to that. It's called The Discovery of Witches. It has a lovely woodcut of Matthew Hopkins and the witches and their familiars, and it's really that cements his reputation as an important man of his time. It's that book and it's that one picture that makes us remember him the way we do.
It's organised in a sort of a Q&A method. It's sort of a criticism and then his response to it. So it's very clearly structured. This is what they said about me and this is how I'm responding.
The tone of the book is extremely self-defensive, rather embittered, I think, that such things should be said against him when actually Hopkins believed that he was a sincere, godly warrior whose only motivation really was to root out wicked witches from East Anglia's communities. We simply don't know how many copies were printed and how many copies were sold, but with the subject matter and with this garish illustration, I think we can assume that it was actually a bit of a bestseller.
Shortly after he publishes his book, Matthew Hopkins dies. He dies very young, probably still in his 20s. It's a very quiet end to a very noisy career, a quiet death of a young man, tragic in its own way, in a small village, but it does bring to an end the witch hunt that he and others had started in 1645.
Matthew Hopkins, after his death, becomes a kind of a folk devil. Partly, I think, because of that famous woodcut on his book, The Discovery of Witches. Hopkins has been called many things over the years. The Napoleon of witch finding, the foulest of foul parasites, the Grand Inquisitor. But the name with which he will be associated for all time was the name that he gave himself, and that was Witchfinder General.
After Matthew Hopkins' death, he was quite widely mocked. Many people did not agree with what he had done, and even to his supporters, it must have seemed that his crusade had ended in failure. John Stern outlives Matthew Hopkins, even though he's probably an older man, and he goes home. And he certainly felt he'd been hard done by, and he felt under threat as a result of his witch-finding activities. He regards himself as somebody who's been cancelled and silenced, and that's the last that we hear of him, protesting from his village home.
There never are again persecutions in East Anglia on the scale of the Hopkins trials. In that sense, it does kind of go away. Hopkins is a one-off.
What you find is that across the whole of the 16th and 17th centuries in England, we know about 1,000 trials happened and probably around about 500 executions. But the extraordinary thing is that a quarter of those trials happen in East Anglia in the years 1645 to 7. So in the East Anglian witch hunt, about 300 people are interrogated and questioned, and 100 of them are executed. We always know the names of Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, but it's also really important to remember the names of the people whose deaths they orchestrated. So names of people like Margaret Moore of Sutton or Rose Hallibread from St Osyth in Essex.
Ellen Driver, Mary Scrutton, Margaret Wyatt, Mary Vervey, Priscilla Collett, and Elizabeth Clark.
This is the only mass witch trial in Ireland.
A woman seems to become the trigger of demonic possession.
She's crying out in pain, whole body tremors.
The reason the demon is afflicting this person is because a witch has sent the demon.
She is tortured herself by ghostly attackers.
It is a haunted place, and it's haunted by this witch trial. Isla Magee is in County Antrim. County Antrim is what is now Northern Ireland. It sticks out just above Belfast in Northern Ireland. Anne Haltridge is an elderly matriarch. She's Presbyterian of Scots descent, and she's also the widow of Reverend John Haltridge.
Anne Haltridge moved to Island Magee in order to spend her last years looked after by her son's family.
Anne lived in Nowhead House. It was a stone's throw away from the Presbyterian church. Anne lives there with her son James and his wife, 2 children, and his servant Margaret Spear.
But everything starts to go wrong.
Anne Haltridge is reading on her own, and suddenly stones start hitting her. She can't see where they're from. They're coming through the window and bashing her right in the back of the head.
And the household sees weird things going on. Bedclothes are disarranged. Some of them are rearranged in the shape of a corpse on the bed.
She goes to bed that night, and what she starts feeling, terrifyingly, is this presence crawling slowly up her feet, up her legs, and over her head. She hears scratching and noises. So Anne Haltridge is beginning to wonder what's happening.
Anne is also haunted by an apparition of a demonic boy.
And he is a small boy. She tells the household they think he's basically a beggar.
She doesn't think so, and whether he's real or not, he seems to her to be a manifestation of the devil.
The main witness is the servant, Margaret Spear.
The boy says the devil has taught him to read. To people in the 18th century, and particularly extreme Protestants, like the Haltridge family, they would have thought of it as a demonic phenomenon.
This is a Presbyterian Protestant community where you learn about God. You learn about your duties to the Christian faith through reading. It's very important.
Then, as suddenly as he appeared, the boy is gone. For several months, an uneasy peace falls on Nowhead House. But on the 12th of February, 1711, the boy returns.
He's threatened to kill everybody in the house. He produces a sword and starts digging a grave. He says to Margaret Spear, "I'm digging this grave for your master, James Haltridge. He's dead. I've killed him." We know that that's not the case.
What Anne and her family are experiencing is a phenomenon called obsession. And that's when the devil is trying to possess you, but actually he's outside your body. He can't quite get in. So obsessed people would be people who would see strange visions, to whom weird things like stone throwing might happen. And this was all because the devil was thought to be controlling their body and their mind externally.
People could be tormented by demons in various ways. This so-called demonic obsession might proceed in some extreme situations into full bodily possession, whereby the demon ceases merely to menace externally the victim, but actually enters the body. Bad spirits could get inside a person through the mouth or through some other orifice.
What starts off as something outside of the body starts to internalise.
Anne claims to be the victim of stabbing pains administered by invisible antagonists, who are demons as far as the Presbyterians are concerned.
With anything like this, where they're being attacked by a demonic entity, the first port of call is the local minister, Reverend Sinclair. He is a leading man in that small community. His church is at the centre of that community. He believes in witchcraft. He lives in a community that believes in witchcraft. Reverend Sinclair comes in and starts praying for Mrs. Haltridge. If this was a Roman Catholic priest, he may have performed the ritual of exorcism.
If you're trying to rescue a possessed person from the demon that is possessing them, what you're doing is you're exorcising that person, commanding the demon to depart.
And you're using the sign of the cross, sometimes you use a bit of holy water.
Protestants reject all these consecrated objects and they say, well, that's just Catholic superstition, that's wicked. But as a result, they leave themselves with a relatively limited range of techniques.
They can't command. What they can do is pray.
To ease her terrible suffering, Reverend Sinclair prays for Anne Haltridge. But it is not enough. Her condition worsens. And on February 22nd, 1711, she dies. The cause of death, unknown.
You'd expect the period of mourning for her to be very solemn, to be very quiet.
But shortly after her death, another extraneous relative arrives at Island Magee.
James's cousin, Mary Dunbar. She is from Castlereagh, which is just outside of Belfast. She's a stranger to Island Magee. She says she hasn't been within 15 miles of the place before.
Mary is around 18 years old, and no sooner has she settled into the household than all the weirdness breaks out again.
On the 27th of February, Mary Dunbar finds a fabric parcel.
An apron that's been tied up in weird knots. Now, the tying and untying of knots is a traditional means of working magic by witches.
Many cultures have elaborate protective magics. Typically, a knotting spell will be a way of trying to set a spell. You work the spell, and at the moment where you say you conclude the spell, you tie the knot, and the knot acts to fix the spell. All of this is sympathetic magic.
The sympathies between the intended victim and their belongings. So you do one, and it happens to the other.
So it's assumed that because the knots are in a weird pattern, that there's some kind of magic involved. Guess what? Mary Dunbar elects to untie the knots and see what happens.
Mary Dunbar pulls at the cursed knots. The apron unfolds, and a curious object falls to the floor. A bonnet that belonged to the recently deceased Anne Haltridge.
By untying it, Mary seems to have let out some sort of demonic force, which then fastens on her.
And witches use something belonging to the victim to bewitch it. Whatever they do to the object belonging to them happens to the individual.
It's now Mary Dunbar who is the apparent centre of the demonic attacks.
She's screaming out, caught with a stabbing pain, and then she goes into convulsive fits.
Demonic possession was recognised by well-established symptoms: physical contortion, unnatural bodily strength,
endless fits,
trances,
and also a recoiling from holy objects like blessed water or crucifixes, and simply the word of God. Now, one further indication of demonic possession was that a possessed person would accuse somebody else of casting a demon into their body. It's because of this that very often demon possession was associated with witchcraft.
Mary Dunbar claims to be attacked by the spirits of witches.
She starts to go into trances, and she starts to see the images of women attacking her.
She can visualize their features.
In the midst of the spectral attack, she hears the name of one of her tormentors, Janet Carson, a local woman unknown to Mary.
The Reverend Sinclair proceeds to investigate things as best he can.
There's a test that's been performed since the 16th century for witchcraft, which is to bring the suspected witch close to the supposedly obsessed or possessed person and see if they react to it, even if they can't see the witchcraft suspect.
The approach of the person who has bewitched you will make you worse. Sympathetic magic, the cause and the effect coming together.
So this is done with Janet Carson. She's brought into the room, and of course the victim does react, and that's held to confirm that she must in fact be a witch.
Janet Carson is the first person accused of witchcraft in Island McGee. But she won't be the last.
It made perfect sense that the Haldridge household would be attacked by the devil. They were pious. It was a godly household. It was a light in the darkness. So the question is, why Mary Dunbar? She's young, she's educated, she's the type the devil would try to tempt, try to corrupt. He is, after all, in the popular mind, the great corrupter and the great tempter. And she's a perfect target, just like Anne was before her. Mary Dunbar's fits continue. Convulsive, whole body tremors. They were lasting up to 8 minutes, and she's able to point towards 2 further women. Janet Liston and Elizabeth Seller. They're a mother and a daughter.
Mary can even describe the witches. They're short, and one struggles to walk. But Reverend Sinclair is cautious. Can he trust these visions?
They are living in an era of increasing skepticism. They know that these symptoms can and have been faked in the past, and they want to make sure. They don't want to send an innocent person to jail or worse. So they continue to test.
There is a passage in the Bible that says, "Believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God." If you encounter a spirit, if you encounter something supernatural, you have to work out what it is. If somebody else has encountered a spirit or encountered something supernatural, you have to question them to work out what it is. It could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. The good spirits, you've got angels. Bad spirits, the devil and demons. So if you encounter a spirit, it could well be a demon.
Again, a test is arranged. A lineup is organised, a bit like an identity parade, and it contains about 30 different women. It's expected that because Mary Dunbar is not from Island McGee, that it will be a good test of her to see if she can recognise the women whose names she's already been mentioning as suspects. Not only does she pick out the suspects in the lineup, she actually reacts in a very extreme manner to them. This is thought again to be proof of their witchcraft.
Reverend Sinclair quizzes Janet and Elizabeth on the Bible, but also to say the Lord's Prayer. This is a classic test of witchcraft.
Janet Liston and Elizabeth Sellers stumble as they recite the Lord's Prayer. To the pious, this is a sign. The devil has their tongue.
This, in the end, convinces the Reverend that there is a case, and he then takes it to the authorities.
To do so, they have to go to the main legal power in the local area, Mayor Edward Clements. He is Justice of the Peace, and they investigate charges that are serious. They are responsible for drawing up witness statements or depositions and for jailing people to appear in the criminal court. They are usually gentry, they're usually of independent means, and they're Protestants, and they decide whether it's worthy of looking into. In this case, Mayor Edward Clements does investigate it.
March 4th, 1711. Mayor Clements arrives in Island McGee to launch his investigation. Here, he is told a new apparition threatens Mary Dunbar. But only the Christian name of this elusive witch is known, Catherine.
This time the tests are slightly different. Edward Clements rounds up all the Catherines in his district and brings them to Mary to see if she knows which one is the witch. And she does. She picks out Catherine MacAlmond. Catherine MacAlmond's house is searched.
Edward Clements is following very, very careful instructions in a Justice of the Peace manual that summarises the 1586 Irish Witchcraft Act that makes witchcraft illegal in Ireland.
They're governed by English law, even though they are Scottish Presbyterians in Ireland. And what the authorities are looking for are things like wax images into which pins or thorns might have been stuck in order to afflict Mary Dunbar and others. They're also looking for animal familiars.
This is an English trope, but they're looking for it, and they can't find anything.
Back at No Head House, the apparent demonic possession of Mary Dunbar grows ever more intense.
There's this circus that develops around Mary Dunbar. She is talking about demonic visions.
5 women have been accused. How many more will be accused? How many more people will be dragged from their homes and tested?
Until the early 18th century, Irish people don't seem to have been nearly as obsessed with witches as was the rest of Europe.
Although there are plenty of accusations, there are very few formal prosecutions. There was a famous case of Alice Keitler in Kilkenny in 1324. She runs away, but her associate is executed. In 1655, with Marion Fisher, it's quashed and she's let off. Florence Newton in 1661. She's accused of bewitching a young servant. It's assumed she was found guilty and executed.
Irish people seem to have other ways of explaining the supernatural, whether that's to do with fairies or ghosts or supernatural creatures.
But in Eilean Magee, you're dealing with a different belief system. You're dealing with Presbyterians looking for new lives coming from Scotland.
The Elizabethan settlement policy was in full swing in the north, and the idea was basically to displace the indigenous Irish population, which was Catholic and Gaelic speaking, and replace it with an English speaking Protestant population, mostly imported from Scotland. It's that population who are already coming from a culture where witchcraft beliefs are common and witchcraft prosecutions normal. Therefore, it's significant that the Eilean Magee trial happens fairly far north, at exactly the part of Ireland that's been most thickly settled with Protestants.
They are also Presbyterians, members of the Scottish Protestant Church, which is far more radically Protestant than the Church of Ireland, and in a mutual hostility with it. It's an island of potential witch hunting transplanted to a new land.
They brought a genuine belief in the devil, and they brought a belief in witchcraft. But this is the early 18th century, and the court system that the Justice of the Peace has to use is an English imposition.
Witch trials have become harder and harder to hold. Judges were much more resistant to the idea of holding a witch trial or allowing the suspect to be convicted. By that point, people have started asking better questions about whether witchcraft exists or not. There were changes in the way that evidence was demanded. There needed to be more evidence, basically, before they could be convicted.
What they really want is a voluntary confession. You cannot torture under English common law for a confession. So the physical evidence of witchcraft becomes more important. So Mary Dunbar, you don't have to look too hard for the evidence, really. She is a body of evidence. The demon inside her doesn't want to hear the prayers of Sinclair, so reacts to the prayers and she goes into fits and convulsions. Her teeth been so tightly clenched together, they have to feed her through a quill and open her teeth with key. Her spectral visions gets worse. She names a further 2 suspects, Janet Main and Janet Latimer. Janet Main is from Broad Island, outside at Isle of Magee. The net of suspects is being cast wider. Janet Latimer is unable to answer questions put to her, and she can't say the Lord's Prayer. Neither can Janet Main. Mayor Clements has got enough evidence, so he puts them in jail to await trial, which will be in a few weeks' time. They'll also be put in chains and bolts to stop them leaving their body spectrally. Iron is used to counteract magic in Ireland. It is a very folkloric thing. It's embedded in the popular consciousness. It looks strange to modern eyes, but putting them in chains is very important to the process of protecting Mary Dunbar. Because they're incarcerated, because the iron is stopping them using their magic, Mary Dunbar is able to rest easy. It should be over, but it isn't. The fits start again. The convulsions start again.
After the latest demonic attacks, Mary Dunbar names 2 new witches, Janet Miller and Margaret Mitchell.
It's been asked why Mary doesn't simply leave the house. If it's become so uncomfortable for her and she's so afflicted when she's in it. But she says, and it's proved by her actions, that every time she tries to leave, she's afflicted again. She falls down in what appears to be a faint or a trance as soon as she crosses the threshold of the house.
Threshold magic is based on the idea that a house is something that keeps things out and also keeps things in. At the points where there are openings, whether those are windows, doors, or chimneys, there's always a possibility of something sneaking in that you didn't want to be in there.
The main means by which evil can get in, or good can be penned in. If you want to keep somebody indoors, is to stick a curse on the doorstep.
It's sometimes just a marking, which can even be made with chalk. It could be children's shoes, the skull of a horse, the body of a cat. All these are magics that are intended to make you feel a bit sick and walk away. And that's what threshold magic is. And it's very big to this day in Ireland. And there are very many survivals of it in the British Isles overall.
So on the 5th of March, local officials dig up the threshold of the house. And lo and behold, there's a terrible smell of sulphur. So they think, well, we've uncovered the source of the magic here. Perhaps now Mary can leave the house.
Escaping the evils of No Head House, Mary Dunbar finds sanctuary in the home of a trusted friend in the nearby town of Larne.
Larne is just across the water from Isle of Magee. It's a small town. You get there by boat from the tip of the peninsula of Isle of Magee. It's on the way to Carrickfergus, where their court would be. When she's going there, it should have been an easy journey. But when she's on the way, she sees Janet Main in a spectral form threatening her. This should be impossible because she's safely locked up in jail and she's chained and unable to escape her body. But here she is again, having a further attack on Mary Dunbar. How does Main appear to Mary Dunbar? She's meant to be locked up in jail. Well, rather than being bolted up all day, which they should have been, they've been taken out of jail by the jailer. She's actually been taken to his house to card and spin linen, taken out of her bolts and out of prison, and this allows them to spectrally attack Mary Dunbar.
Having spent 2 weeks safely in Larne, Mary Dunbar must make the journey to Carrickfergus, where the accused witches await their trial.
The judges meet Mary Dunbar. They do so because they're really cautious about staging the trial at all, but they must have been convinced that she was a compelling witness. They were struck by the fact that she seemed ladylike, she seemed educated, she seemed respectable, and she seemed innocent. And so the trial went ahead.
Both in the court and outside of the court were packed out. It was a big deal.
They are tried by 2 professional judges, but with a local jury deciding the verdict.
This trial had 19 witnesses. They're brought in randomly, and it's hard to follow the case. The range of religious and political might is against these poor, marginalised women. You can imagine how frightening this would have been. But they stood up for themselves.
None of the women have confessed, which is quite unusual.
The judges were very concerned to keep stating the importance of reaching a fair verdict, and they warned continually about the consequences.
And we've got a problem here.
One of the judges supports the evidence, and the other judge says the evidence is preposterous.
The kinds of arguments that people were making against the criminal prosecution of witches were increasingly accepted by the later 17th century and the early 18th century than had perhaps previously been the case. Many educated people began to accept a model of the world that operated according to the principles of mathematics and what today we might think of as natural science. And that view of the world, for many people, was incompatible with the idea of evil spirits and bewitchment.
The Eileen McGee case is a perfect example of a case where the elite don't side with the popular belief at all. It becomes characteristic of the best educated people to be really skeptical about witchcraft and to set out to disprove it. Increasingly, people treat people who purport to be demonically possessed or bewitched as mental cases. Who says this girl is not possessed, she's simply hysterical, and she just needs medical treatment. So it certainly becomes possible increasingly to think of what would once have been regarded as witchcraft for sure, as something else altogether, something scientific and something entirely secular.
Trouble is, the jury is Scots Presbyterian, which thoroughly believes in the power of the devil and of witchcraft, and so it proceeds to convict.
They weren't sentenced to death, but they were sentenced to a year in prison, and they had to make 4 appearances at the pillory in local market towns.
Put in a contraption which imprisons the head and the hands, so you're standing helpless. The problem there is you can't defend your face, and so if the crowd is against you, and in Eileen McGee it is, they will pelt you, and you could be seriously injured.
The other punishment is imprisonment for a year. These prisons are not designed to punish people for any length of time. They're there for short stay. So being there for a year must have been horrendous.
They were dirty, they were full, overflowing with people, so there was no privacy from the smell, the presence of your fellow prisoners, some of whom would have been quite dangerous.
These women fought with everything they had against these charges, and they didn't have much. They were poor, they were marginalised, but they didn't go along with it. They were fighting against it. They stood up in court where the great and the good were ranged against them, and they said, no, we didn't do it. None of these women, till the end, admitted it. And for that, we should be terribly proud of them.
Even after the conviction of the 8 suspects, the matter was not over for Mary Dunbar.
She is still being demonically possessed when everybody she's accused is in jail. A man threatens her with a knife in spectral form and stabs her. They have a look at her shoulder. They can see a physical scar on her shoulder where she's been stabbed.
Mary Dunbar is able to recognize and name her attacker, William Seller.
William Seller is husband to Janet Liston and father to Elizabeth Seller. William Seller is tracked down to a tavern. Then he is arrested, but it's not over. It takes a dramatic turn. In late April, William Seller's accuser, the centre of the whole case, Mary Dunbar, dies suddenly. We know about the death of Mary Dunbar because it's reported in the newspaper. And it's very stark. It just says the person who accused witches who were lately tried at Carrickfergus is dead. Doesn't tell us why.
And that changes the fate of William Seller, who is in jail for practising witchcraft against her. It changes his trial to one which appears to be about murder of Mary Dunbar. William is suddenly on trial for his life.
Under the 1586 Witchcraft Act, if you murder using witchcraft, you can be executed. He is tried and he is found guilty. We don't know if he was executed, we can't find his body, but he was found guilty, so it's assumed it was carried out.
And if that happened, it would have been a spectacularly late execution for witchcraft in the history of the British Isles, one of only 3 in Irish history, and an entire generation after which executions had ceased in England. This is an amazing story, and it's so recently discovered we haven't really yet got our heads round it.
It's difficult to say what happened in the case of Mary Dunbar. Did she really think that she was being afflicted by supernatural forces?
Demon possession was regarded with some suspicion because, of course, it was possible to fake.
Demonic possession starts to become more prominent in the later stages of the Great European Witch Hunt. There comes to be a sort of shared body of knowledge as to how a demoniac should behave. Presumably Mary Dunbar may well have heard about the other recent cases and known how to behave. My impression is that there is some psychological disorder of some kind behind much of this. These demoniacs are not simply faking the whole thing, but they're just being encouraged to behave in certain specific ways to take the symptoms of their psychiatric disorder in a particular direction.
Historians warn of imposing modern medical diagnosis onto the past because diseases change. People who are trying to find modern medical explanations are relying on evidence that is quite sparse. Now, if it was an illness, did she fake it? She is a young woman in a very restrictive family. She has constraints placed on what she can do and what she can't do. It's also a way for her to challenge the restrictions placed on her. This allows her to behave in ways that would be otherwise unacceptable. So this brings her to centre stage. It's a drama of her own creation.
That still doesn't explain everything, though. Some of the things that she describes couldn't have been done by one person acting alone. She would have to have had help.
When you look at Anne Haltridge's demonic obsession, Mary's possession, one of the people who see it all is the servant, Margaret Spear. Mary Dunbar probably needed help faking it because things happen when she's not there. It would also explain why Mary could track these people down through their names and through what they looked like. It could have came from Margaret Spear,
who identified people for her, briefed her, and helped set things up for her.
She's from that area. She may have known these people. So there is things we can't explain. But so much can't be.
It's most likely these events were caused by Mary Dunbar and Margaret Spear fighting for attention. But so much remains unexplained. What caused Anne Haltridge's possession and death? How could Janet Maine's attack occur just as she was taken out of prison? And what was behind the mysterious death of Mary Dunbar?
This is the kind of witchcraft case that you get in the later stages of the Great European Witch Hunt. It's very colourful, it's very dramatic, it's also controversial. Either the stories of yes, she was genuine, or indeed the story of yes, she was faking. These are both stories that people want to tell, and sometimes you see both stories being told about the same person.
But her sudden death is an extraordinary event, presumably a complete coincidence, but it's the kind of thing of which true melodrama is made.
We'll never really know what happened in the case of Mary Dunbar, but it does make a fantastic story, and it convinced the judges at her witch trial.
Despite many unanswered questions, the trials in Island McGee have ended, but their horrors continue.
The Island McGee case is unusual in Ireland. 9 people were convicted for witchcraft, and it is the only trial in Ireland that a man is prosecuted and convicted and, as far as we know, hung for witchcraft. When the rest of Europe is stopping prosecuting witches, this is at the point a trial happens in Ireland. But in Island McGee itself, it is a haunted place, and it's haunted by this witch trial. It haunts the folk history. People won't go past No Head House at night. There's an old rocking stone that witches are said to have danced on at night, and people not go near it. But something has changed by the early 18th century. In Ireland, there is no more witch trials. Nobody is formally prosecuted, and there's no convictions.
The Great European Witch Hunt does have an overall arc. It goes up, and then it goes down again.
Ireland's last ever witch trial is over, and mass trials and accusations of witchcraft fade away throughout the Western world.
We are at a point of change, and part of the reason is an increasing judicial scepticism, finding it hard to get convincing proof of witchcraft.
In the mid to late 17th century, we start to get judges and legal writers being more sceptical about witchcraft prosecutions.
In order for witch trials to happen and for people to be prosecuted and executed, the elite, the top 20% at least, have consistently to believe that there are real witches and that they are a real threat. The actual prosecutions stop happening because the elite no longer believe.
And when they doubt the evidence, then trials end because they're pointless. And when trials end, the laws against witchcraft get repealed. Then convictions subside. The other thing is that witch hunting doesn't work. It doesn't produce better luck, better weather, better children. Instead, it disrupts and demoralizes and decimates communities. And the Protestant and Catholic have failed to wipe each other out, so they're having to learn to tolerate each other.
Each side wants to prove that it's more godly than the other lot. They both hate witches, but the biggest change is that they want to stop killing each other for it.
The world is moving towards a change in the way that people think about society, about each other, and a belief in greater tolerance, in not killing each other, and of being more charitable towards other people.
So it looks as if God is lightening up. The weather gets better, Christian Europe gets stronger and more self-confident in defeating its enemies. Epidemic disease recedes for the first time in hundreds of years.
The people who accused others of witchcraft were afraid of witches. They were dealing with what seemed to them to be real dangers in the world, and a genuine desire to deal with a dangerous but difficult crime. And that has been lost, because today we don't believe in bad magic. And with it, our appreciation of the genuine fears of people in the past. And it prevents us from appreciating truly the tragedy of witch persecutions. Because if we imagine the people that accused others of witchcraft as being malicious or suffering from hysteria, then we won't take the lesson, which is that well-meaning and rational people might sometimes make terrible mistakes. And that seems to me to be a much more important lesson to take from the age of what we think of today as witch hunts.
The great European witch hunt has gone.
But that's only the story in Western Europe and North America. Around the world today, witch trials still continue. In Southern Africa, in Indonesia, parts of the Indian subcontinent and Nepal. That's perhaps another story. But it's the story of ongoing witch trials. We're still in the era of the witch hunt today.
For centuries, witch hunts raged through Europe and the Americas.
Everybody believed in the existence of witches.
The trials catch fire,
causing the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent people.
It was extraordinary.
To this day, the most infamous hunt of all ravaged a small religious community in colonial Massachusetts.
Salem was a community that was already riven with hostility to one's neighbours.
The horrors begin when children in the minister's house have violent fits, an affliction that seems to be caused by the devil, triggering a savage, unstoppable panic that saw hundreds accused of witchcraft by their neighbors, friends, and family.
This great network of witches all working together across the area.
They know at the end of this that they could be judged guilty of witchcraft and they'll be hanged.
Once you've crossed that line of actually executing someone, it's very difficult to stop.
It could never go back to the way it was. This was a war zone.
This is the story of the Salem witch trials.
Salem is a Puritan community.
The Puritans were a dissenting branch of the Anglican Church who fled England in the early 1600s.
They were concerned that living in England, the hierarchy of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was telling them what to do, was making them believe things that they didn't actually want to believe. So off they go to America to found their own church and to own their own doctrine.
As the Puritan population increased over the coming decades, they established multiple colonies in what would become the northeast of the United States. Really the locus of Puritan influence and the locus of the Congregational Church was in Massachusetts, was in places like Boston and Salem.
The community at Salem is a Congregationalist community, which means that the people there have a belief that the congregation itself should be able to shape how the church works.
Puritans in Salem Village have the power to elect a new minister to lead their congregation. They nominate the recently ordained Samuel Parris.
Samuel Parris arrived in Salem Village in 1689.
He's come to Salem from Barbados. He has had a bit of a career as a merchant before then. He's not actually very successful. He comes to New England to try his luck at something new, at something different in this new colony that's just sort of building itself up in the 17th century.
He sails first to Boston, where he lives for a couple of years with his family, and then to Salem Village.
Salem Village is a kind of an appendage to Salem Town. Salem Town is the much more prosperous community.
Salem Village was fractious. This was not considered a destination for an ambitious minister like Parris.
He enters into the community and he starts sifting out the most godly people around him to join his sort of special congregation of particularly pious villagers.
I think he's quite an embittered individual, and I think he tends to take that frustration out through very, very sort of impassioned preaching.
Because he's a new minister, he's very keen to prove his place in the village and his utility to the local community.
Parris has overseen the church in Salem for 2 difficult years. When this highly religious community is thrown into disarray, young girls in nearby villages have been experimenting with magic.
They had been doing something known as the egg and glass. The idea was that you would take an egg and you would then drip the white of the egg into a bowl of water and look at the shapes it makes. You were asking God to give you some insight into what shape your future would take.
What starts off as playing around with fortune telling becomes more sinister. What they saw in the water was the shape of a coffin. They start feeling very worried.
This kind of divination was regarded as demonic.
It's impossible to know if Samuel Parris's daughter Betty and niece Abigail took part in these rituals, but something terrible happens shortly afterwards.
Betty Parris starts showing strange symptoms of affliction. This then spreads to Abigail.
They start saying that their muscles hurt and they start screaming. You can imagine how distressing that would have been for their family.
This upheaval is coming from right inside the house of the minister.
The Reverend Samuel Parris calls in the doctor. He says, "It is supernatural. I can't cure it, so it must be witchcraft."
The people of Salem, they're very religious. They believe in God, but that means they believe in the devil too. They're kind of on the lookout for witchcraft.
There had certainly been plenty of cases in Europe involving what was known as bewitchment. What was happening to Betty and Abigail seemed to follow this recognised model. There was an established precedent for blaming this on witches.
When the community has decided to accept the idea that these girls are being attacked by witches, the next stage in the process is then to say, and who is it who is doing this to you? Who is afflicting you?
The names that come up are two women of middling age who were unpopular within their community. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. The other name we have is Tituba. Tituba was a servant in the house of Samuel Parris.
I think her name was probably originally something like Tatabay. She comes from a grouping on the South American mainland called the Tatabetana.
There was that ethnic difference compared to the people surrounding her.
And it's kind of that classic idea of assuming that people who are different are more likely to be in league with things that are deemed evil and unfamiliar to you.
Abigail and Betty might have picked on Tituba as well, because Betty's father Samuel may have been critical of a woman of colour who lived in his community. I can imagine him bullying Tituba. I can imagine him speaking critically about her, maybe thinking she wasn't a good enough Christian. So it's really no surprise to Samuel when Abigail and Betty start pointing the finger at Tituba and saying that she's a witch. The affliction starts spreading from Abigail and Betty to their friends, the Putnam family. They start exhibiting the same symptoms. They start screaming in the night. They start convulsing. They start pointing the finger and saying that they too are bewitched by the people that Abigail and Betty have suspected.
First of March, 1692. The accused are dragged in front of magistrates. A confession is needed before they're sent to trial. For all the women, it's a terrifying ordeal. Especially Tituba, the woman of indigenous or African heritage.
Tituba begins by denying that she did anything at all.
She's in front of these powerful white men. She's probably been hurt, and she's certainly been enslaved by powerful white men. This is a very bullying power relationship that she's in this room.
These women were looking for ways to try and save themselves. Therefore, they might come to say the things that people wanted to hear, confess to imaginary crimes.
In the end, during her questioning, Tituba starts to say, "I did hurt the children." She said, "The devil came to me, and the devil kept saying to me, 'You must hurt the children, you must hurt the children.' He threatened me," she said. "He said he would kill me, he would tear me to pieces, he would cut my head off."
With Tituba's confession secured, the magistrates also questioned the other two women accused of being witches, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne.
As part of this questioning, Sarah Good's young daughter Dorothy was asked about whether her mother was in fact a witch. She was only 4. What was she expected to say? And of course she says, yes, my mother is a witch, and she admits witchcraft herself, which is particularly shocking. The people of Salem send the suspects off to Boston, the capital of the colony of Massachusetts, to await trial. They're kept in chains. There are women. There are some children, like Dorothy Good. There are people who are absolutely desperate.
Although the accused women have been jailed, it will be many months until a trial can proceed.
The colony of Massachusetts, it's governed under a charter from the British government, and the charter has expired. The governor and many of the leading men of the colony have gone off to England to secure a new charter to make sure that its legal processes can continue to function.
Although the Salem town magistrates can question suspects, they can't really start any trials until the governor arrives from England. It gives more space and time for the afflictions to spread and the concern of the community to grow.
During that time, questions keep on being asked. A lot of other names start getting mentioned. And these women who are sitting around in these jail cells happen to keep remembering other people who might have been involved. Things start to spiral.
Months pass. The people of Salem Village grow ever more convinced that witches walk amongst them.
Further accusations are coming from the supposedly afflicted girls.
Samuel Powys is preaching about witchcraft to the congregation, and the contagion seems to be continuing. There are stories of more girls getting afflicted.
The suspects also carry on being questioned, and they carry on telling stories about the witchcraft that they've supposedly committed. They name new suspects back in Salem Village, people like Bridget Bishop, and then these people are brought in for questioning too.
Most news is spread by word of mouth. People communicated at the marketplace, when they were trading.
About 75% of those who are accused are female. And that's because women are seen as particularly prone to becoming witches. They're seen as gateways of the devil. They're seen as people who might fall prey to these sort of demonic lies. Samuel Powys also asked the previous minister of Salem, Deodat Lawson, to come and visit and see what he thinks of the situation.
And then he goes to the Parris household and he sees Betty Parris in one of her fits.
She's running around the room screaming. She's trying to climb out of the window and fly.
And he writes an account of what he saw and what he experienced while he was in Salem Village.
As a minister and trusted member of society, Lawson's vivid account adds credibility to the witch hunt.
The first accused witches were the outsiders. They were those you might consider the usual suspects in witchcraft. But as the accusations grow, more and more prominent people are actually drawn into this net.
The sorts of people who you would not expect to be giving themselves up to the devil.
They're not people who might be seen as outsiders or scapegoats, like the Native American Tituba or the homeless person Sarah Good. These are prime, upstanding members of Samuel Powys's congregation. People like Rebecca Nurse, who's been a member of the church all her life and is seen by her neighbours as being a pious and good person.
She's a pillar of the godly community. You would expect her to be protected from accusation.
But nevertheless, she's named as a witch. As the accusations spread, they dig deeper and deeper into Salem's community.
We have to begin from the important fact that everybody believed in the existence of witches. And so as these rumors begin spreading, there's a sense of crisis. There's a sense that Satan is actually successfully waging this war on their community.
Salem was a community that was already riven with division.
You've got the tension between Salem Village and Salem Town. Salem Village is more backward looking, much poorer than Salem Town.
Salem Town is wealthier, it's fancier, it's becoming more interested in the refinements of society, the kind of things that Puritans disapprove of very strongly indeed.
And then you've got Parris. Rather than smoothing things over and calming things down, he really intensifies the factions and the resentments. And I think the fact that the afflictions of the children start in his household suggests that he very much is at the centre of a lot of this concern.
Within Salem Village, there is a division between two of the prominent families, and those are the Putnams and the Porters.
The Porter households and their allies were much more politically linked to Salem Town, whereas the Putnams are inward-looking, much more linked to Parris as the Salem Village minister, much more older-fashioned in their emphasis on Puritan godliness. The accused witches tended to come from the Porter network, whereas the afflicted tended to be much more closely linked to the Parris-Putnam faction.
The villagers are turning on each other, But beyond the village, there are even worse threats. There are Native American peoples who the villagers have taken their land, essentially, and they've dispossessed them. There's also famine because they don't know which kind of crops to grow. The Native Americans aren't helping them anymore, naturally enough. There's disease. There are wars to the north in Maine. And some of the people who are doing the accusing in Salem Village are probably refugees from the war. We're dealing with people who are really traumatised.
All of these factors are then feeding into the division at Salem and perpetuating this mood of suspicion, potentially of hostility to one's neighbours. Between January and May, we end up with 81 people accused of witchcraft, 49 of whom are imprisoned.
This is developing into a massive social, cultural, political crisis.
Several months after the first accusations, Governor Phipps arrives with the new Massachusetts Charter in hand. He now has the power to open the courts, and the accused will either find justice and freedom or a brutal death.
When the governor arrives back from England with the new charter, he has a range of pressing matters to deal with. There are Native American wars going on to the north. There are wars between the English and the French, and he has to go in person to intervene. So he's not present in the colony of Massachusetts for quite some time after his arrival. However, he's briefed about the people awaiting trial for witchcraft in Boston Jail, and on May the 27th, he sets up a special court to deal with them, a court of Oyer and Terminer, which means to hear and determine.
Which is basically an old English method for dealing with a legal emergency. It was used in the Middle Ages for things like popular rebellion, when you've suddenly got a really unusual number of trials that you need to get through.
The trials are held in the meeting house, so essentially the community's own church. It's a packed room, it's a hot room, it's a noisy room, it's crowded. It must have felt incredibly intimidating.
This is a spectacle that a lot of villagers, some of whom don't think so highly of the accused, are coming to watch.
Governor Phipps won't lead the court himself, he won't be the judge. He asks his friends, the intellectuals, the important men in the community, to help him.
There's also a lot of potential for the judge to steer things in the way that he wants.
As the court assembles in Salem town, the accused witches are led from jail, desperately hoping they will find mercy.
The accused people have to defend themselves. They don't have lawyers.
They would have been reliant on their own words, their own denials. You get this very, very dramatic, peculiar situation where the afflicted girls, including Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, are brought into the courtroom in a group.
They might writhe or whimper or babble.
They actually throw fits in front of the court. They make new accusations. They say things like, she's attacking me, she's screaming at me, she's hitting me.
If the accused witch in the dock raises an arm, the afflicted individuals would react to that. It's quite hard for us to imagine how sensational that would have been and how much their performance kind of convinces people that they're being attacked by witches.
The suspects must have been frightened. They must have been terribly upset by this public humiliation. It must have been an awful, traumatic experience for them. They know at the end of this that they could be judged guilty of witchcraft and that they'll be hanged.
Your options when it came to defending yourself against a witchcraft charge were pretty limited. But there was an idea that those who confessed to the crime had at least shown some kind of repentance, some kind of remorse.
If you confessed, you lost your reputation. Not only had you told a lie before God, but all your neighbours would then judge you to be a witch. You'd be permanently tainted. But also that people who confess will be spared. They will be judged guilty, but they won't be executed. And of course, it's a massive inducement to confess. The judges don't seem to have spotted that one, but it's something that really makes the trials catch fire.
Tituba, the first person accused of witchcraft by the Paris family, finally takes the stand.
Tituba did admit that she was a witch, whether she believed herself to be one or not.
When she introduced this idea that there might be this great network of witches all working together across the area,
and she was spared, therefore. She was not to be executed, she was returned to jail. Of course, that was a punishment in itself, but it did save her life.
those who confessed to the crime might well have helped out the authorities by giving details about what had happened, naming other names.
As one person after another confesses and is spared, the number of witchcraft suspects and convicted witches starts to grow again. As well as sparing confessing suspects, the court also makes another fatal decision, which is to admit what's called spectral evidence. And this is essentially evidence based on the visions of the accusers.
Spectral evidence draws on this idea that the devil has the power to cause hallucinations in people's minds.
Spectral evidence was basically evidence that wasn't visible to most of the townspeople, but was in fact visible to the accusers. Sometimes these spirits admitted their culpability to earlier crimes. Sometimes other spirits accused the supposed witch of a particular crime.
This now is an absolute nightmare when it comes to evidential standards, because what you have here is a form of evidence that is basically impossible to disprove. So spectral evidence allows the trials to escalate, allows them to move further into the realm of fantasy and away from anything we would consider valid proof. Other members of the community are essentially allowing this to happen by not protesting loudly against it. There are cases of brave individuals who try to defend their loved ones, but it was potentially a pretty dangerous business.
Trials are doing very, very quick by comparison with today.
It can be as little as 15 minutes to determine whether somebody lives or dies.
On the 2nd of June, the court of Oyer and Terminer renders their first verdict.
It's Bridget Bishop, and she's sentenced to be hanged.
On the 2nd of June, the court makes its first conviction of Bridget Bishop.
She says not guilty in court, she's condemned to die, but she maintains her innocence to the gallows, and that's quite disturbing for people. Having an execution of someone for witchcraft is dramatic enough, but she's not going to the gallows as a kind of a penitent sinner admitting her guilt. She's actually saying, you guys got it wrong.
The same day, one of the judges actually resigns from the court. So there are already some signs that things aren't going well.
Now an actual execution has happened. Things have got serious. People are getting murdered because of these accusations.
On the 29th of June, one of the original suspects, Sarah Good, is arraigned and formally charged. And she's charged alongside 4 other women: Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe and Sarah Wilde. At that trial, all 5 of the women are found guilty and they're sentenced to death. The 5 women are executed on the 19th of July. Sarah Good turns on the crowd and the ministers and the judges, and she says to them, "I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard, because she is an innocent woman about to be hanged. God will give you blood to drink." And that sounds very much like a curse. But at the same time, it also feels like a bit of a prophecy that this is all going to come to a very bad end indeed.
There's also growing doubts over what's going on now that it's proving just so serious.
A number of ministers are asked for their opinion of the trials, and in particular, the way that spectral evidence is being used. Some people are concerned that the accused people might actually be making up evidence of seeing the spectres of the accused witches. And they want people like Cotton Mather, who is a university intellectual and somebody with wide experience in the field of judging the demonic.
Cotton Mather was regarded as one of the foremost authorities on witches. He wrote widely on the subject, and he wrote widely from a position of real authority as being one of the senior ministers in Massachusetts at the time.
So Cotton Mather and a number of other ministers write a letter to the court in which they sum up their opinion on this type of evidence. It is, however, a very equivocal letter. They say on the one hand that there are some doubts about this kind of evidence and that exquisite caution, as they put it, should be used in judging the accused people. But at the same time, they give the court a pat on the head and they say, well, you should just continue doing what you're doing. Because, of course, the ministers do believe that there are witches in the Salem community.
Very important that a group of men, of Puritan ministers with such influence in the colony, say, be careful. But then they're also saying, but it's a jolly good thing to hunt witches. So it's a very, very difficult situation for the authorities.
Meanwhile, some people are asking questions about why the accusers are making the accusations that they are. Perhaps things have got out of hand and gone too far.
That's part of this beginning of perhaps doubt about the validity of the testimony and the validity of the spectral evidence.
Yet even though there are doubts about the process of the convictions, on August the 19th, a further 5 people are hanged. And one of them is even a former minister, George Burroughs. He's Samuel Parris's predecessor. Burroughs is being accused partly because he's drifted from the position that Samuel Parris feels the church should be occupying.
George gives supposedly this quite impassioned speech where he talks about what's happened, closes it with a perfect recitation of the Lord's Prayer. This was an old stereotype about witches, that they couldn't get through the Lord's Prayer without at some point tripping up. George recites it perfectly, and this also may have generated some doubts in the minds of the onlookers.
The crowd start to murmur and they move towards almost a riot. And they say the execution should be stopped. But who should come along but Cotton Mather, who has come to the executions to watch justice being done. He gives almost a sermon to the crowd in which he says that these people are indeed witches and that there's nothing wrong here. The execution should continue. And of course, because he's a minister, he's a powerful, important figure in the community, the crowd accept his authority. The executions proceed and the 5 people are killed. The bodies aren't even buried properly. They're thrown into a nearby crevice in the rock and partially covered by earth.
As doubts about the witch trials grow, some villagers courageously decide to take a stand, but the repercussions of their actions will prove deadly.
On the 18th of September 1692, one of the witchcraft suspects, Giles Corey, refuses to plead at his trial.
And the courts at this time had a slightly strange idea that if people refused to enter a plea, you could subject them to torments to compel them to do so. And this is what happens to Giles Corey.
It's an act of defiance to not submit a plea and allow yourself to be subjected to torture. And it may be that he would have imagined that he was going to be found guilty either way, that the outcome was inevitable and that he had no control over it.
On the 18th to the 19th of September 1692, he has heavy weights piled on top of him.
That would have been like a suffocation. It's like a slow death.
When they ask him, what do you want to say to the court? He says, more weight.
He had nothing to lose. He's going to die anyway. But he can die with his own dignity and he can die with his own sense of innocence.
But one effect of him dying without entering a plea is that his estate remained his own property and passed to his descendants, to his son-in-laws. If he had died having been convicted of witchcraft, his estate would become the property of the authorities.
Without a plea, trial, or conviction, the execution of Giles Corey is unlawful. His death sends shockwaves through the community. Days later, his wife, Martha Corey, is also executed, sent to the gallows, guilty of witchcraft.
It's an absolute disaster for the community of Massachusetts, and it will leave a terrible legacy.
It's been 7 months now. We've had 185 people accused. 59 have gone to trial, 19 were hanged, others died in prison. This then takes on a life of its own, spreads geographically.
Across communities like Beverly, Malden, Gloucester, Andover, Ipswich, Marblehead, Charlestown, and Boston itself, people are being accused of witchcraft.
The witch hunts spread across New England. They continued to attract the attention of religious experts, including a clergyman and scholar from Boston, Increase Mather, whose son, Cotton Mather, is already deeply involved with the trials in Salem Village.
Increase Mather writes a letter to express some of his doubts, to say that maybe some of the evidence, maybe some of the accusations don't carry the water that we once thought they did. After all, spectral evidence is a pretty slim reed to hang people on.
Increase really begins to call on the Governor Phipps to come and sort stuff out.
Phipps and Increase Mather go back a long way. They came together on the ship from England with the new charter. William Phipps really respects Increase Mather, and what he sees in Increase's letter really concerns him. There's also a rumour going round the colony that somebody has named Mary Phipps, Governor's wife, as a witch.
And it would make sense, from Satan's perspective, not to limit himself to the older, less affluent women that were so often associated with witchcraft. If Satan really meant business, he would go after the elites among them.
So there are a couple of powerful motives for William Phipps to want to put an end to the witch trials. It's a huge crisis and he needs to do something immediately.
Governor Phipps decides that public opinion has shifted enough to call a stop to these proceedings.
Governor Phipps dismantles the courts responsible for the brutal witch trials. The remaining accused are safe from execution.
The people still in jail are released.
Tituba was kept in prison for at least a year. There's a statement from the jailer where he says that he hasn't been paid. And we know that somebody paid that bill, which leads us to think that maybe, in the end, Tituba was freed.
Samuel Parris's role in the witch trials had created such bad blood within the village.
Parris, by that point, is very embittered. He feels that he's failed as a minister.
The family members of some of the executed actually successfully pushed him out of the village and out of his ministry.
So what's left at Salem? Not very much. A dislocated community where neighbours are not speaking to each other. The whole church structure has fallen apart.
The economic impact of that would have been very significant. The pendulum of support swings towards the families of the accused. It becomes an episode the whole community really wants to forget about.
There is a legacy of guilt and unease over the whole affair.
It could never go back to the way it was.
In January 1697, the General Court orders a day of prayer and fasting to reflect back on the history of the witch trials. Then, another of the judges publishes a public apology for his role in the trials.
In 1752, Salem Village rebrands itself. It calls itself Danvers. It's caused a lot of division, a lot of friction.
And then, in the 20th century, it's revisited.
In 1957, the state of Massachusetts apologised for the witch trials. That happened partly because of a play, The Crucible. And that play is really the reason why the Salem witch trials are so famous today. But historians have been trying ever since to explain these terrible events. This started with two young girls being sick at the house of a minister. People have wondered whether the girls were psychotic. Were they lying? Did they make the whole thing up?
A lot of the blame is placed on the girls who made the original accusations. But that exonerates the men who led the trials, who rendered the judgment. These men were the literal adults in the room, and they have blood on their hands, far more so than the young, powerless original accusers.
It's retained this status as a sort of almost archetypal witch hunt, in part because it was extraordinary and it was extreme and it happened so rapidly. It provided this really vivid example of how witch hunts can snowball and how, on the basis of some slightly strange behaviour from 2 adolescent girls, hundreds of people can be accused and a proportion of them can be executed.
You can see that the community's misogyny and racism is reflected in their choice of suspects. Tituba, a Native American woman previously enslaved. Sarah Good, a very poor woman, somebody who was homeless. Sarah Osborne, a woman who was regarded as being insufficiently submissive to those around her.
Dorothy Good, she's gone through seriously traumatic things within this jail and allegedly is insane by the time she's allowed to leave when she's 5.
The lessons that colonists learn from Salem aren't entirely clear. Even the regret over the trials didn't shake anyone's belief in the existence of witches, didn't make them apologetic or regret the wars against Native people on the northern frontier. What Salem did was make them regret the amount of authority that they invested in the young female accusers. That to them was the lesson from Salem, not to trust the word of young women quite like they had before.